Welcome to today's Expert Chat. I'm Jenny with the Understood team, and today we're going to be talking about dyslexia and other reading issues. We have a very, very special guest expert with us today, Dr. Margie Gillis, who is the president and founder of Literacy How. Hi there, Margie. How are you today?
Good. Thank you, Jenny. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Beautiful day here in New York City.
Beautiful here.
Yeah, and Margie, before we get started, could you tell our viewers a little bit more about your background?
Yes, I am a special educator by training. Long time ago, started in the classroom and worked with students with reading difficulties, and I became more interested in dyslexia the more students I worked with that had a specific type of learning disability. And after doing that for about 20 years, I decided to work at the teacher training level. Got my doctorate in special education and started working on professional development for teachers. Worked at Haskins Labs for about 10 years, a research lab in New Haven. And then I founded Literacy How, devoted to empowering teachers with knowledge. So we do provide embedded support for teachers in their classrooms with a team of reading experts we call mentors.
Okay, great. That's a tremendous background, and I thank you once again for being with us, Margie. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, Margie will be taking your questions throughout the chat on the topic of dyslexia and reading issues. If you have a question for Margie, please type it into the chat box. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible today. So let's just get started with the biggest question of them all, Margie. Why do some kids have difficulty learning to read?
So there's lots of reasons, because reading is complicated, and there are a lot of aspects to reading that enter into that complexity or that equation. So there could be problems associated with comprehending language that impact reading comprehension. There could be problems associated with learning vocabulary words, and that also is related to comprehension of language. And then there is the other side of the equation, which has to do with the ability to actually read words, because in order to be a skilled reader, you have to automatically read words. And some children struggle with that skill because they have a problem that is associated with the phonological aspect of language, that is hearing those sounds and being able to understand those sounds and how they relate to letters.
Okay, great. Thank you for summing that up. All right, so how important, Margie, are reading assessments, and why is early diagnosis and treatment so very important?
Yeah, reading assessments are very, very important. So there's different types of reading assessments. We can do what's called a screener, and a screener is going to look at early signs or risk indicators, and those can be administered as early as preschool. And we know there are certain risk indicators for having difficulty learning to read. If we administer those screeners and we find a student or a child who is at risk, then we're going to want to dig deeper, what I call dig deeper, and administer more of a diagnostic assessment. And the diagnostic assessments might get us to the identification of a specific learning disability, dyslexia being one of them, the most common one. And once we get that identification or diagnosis of dyslexia, we don't stop there, because we have to continue to assess to see if the students are learning what they're being taught. And those are referred to as progress monitoring assessments. And so the assessments are an incredibly important part of the process, not only of the identification, but then diagnosing the exact nature of the reading disability or the reading difficulty, and then really getting at, well, where on a continuum of skills is that child, so that I can intervene exactly where that student's difficulties lie, and then continue to improve their skill development.
Okay, so when a child has been found to have a specific learning disability in reading, and I'm going to say specifically dyslexia. What do parents need to know about how their child with dyslexia will learn to read? What do those parents need to pay close attention to?
So what they need to pay close attention to is the fact that developing these skills, these reading skills, is going to be difficult at times. And there, again, going back to what I said earlier about the signs, one of the signs is having difficulty with phonological awareness or phonemic awareness. That is being able to hear, for example, rhyme, do two words rhyme and producing a rhyme. That's an early phonological awareness skill. And then at a higher level, being able to take words apart, sound by sound, and then being able to manipulate those sounds. So they're going to need to be aware that those things are going to be difficult for their child, most likely. The implication is that they're going to have difficulty decoding, that is blending sounds to read words, and encoding, right? Encoding, which is spelling the words. Okay, so those are some things. Another thing they might be alerted to is that they might learn something one day and forget it the next day. So they think that, they've got it, but then a day or 2 days later, they forgot it. So that's a common occurrence. They may also notice that their student gets frustrated very easily because this is hard work for them. School is hard work, and they're working really hard at school, and then they come home and they're exhausted. So they're going to show signs of being tired, being frustrated, etc. So those are just some of, I think, the big ideas associated with things to look out for.
Okay, great. And Margie, we're getting many questions from our viewers, so I'm going to start with, I'm going to combine actually DJS and Daisy's comments. Who typically diagnoses dyslexia, and at what age can a child be diagnosed with dyslexia?
So that's a great question, an important question. I live in the state of Connecticut. We happen to have legislation and a policy and a law that says that dyslexia, number one, exists, and not all states have that law and that language in their policies. So that's important. And now, and this is recent in Connecticut, but more states have these policies and legislative policies saying dyslexia in fact exists. And who does diagnose it? The State Department of Ed in Connecticut doesn't like the term diagnose, because they think of that as associated with a medical diagnosis. So here in the state, we use the term identify. That seems softer, but they mean the same thing. So a special ed teacher, a reading specialist, usually those are the people that would diagnose or identify a child with dyslexia. They have to have background knowledge in assessing and what types of assessment they would administer. There is no one assessment, which makes diagnosing or identifying children complex, because it's not like you can give one test and you get the result and that's it. It's a definitive answer. You are or you're not. It's not straightforward. The other thing you asked about how early, well, dyslexia is really a disability that really impacts reading. So a lot of people say you have to wait till the child is reading. Well, that may not happen until 6 or 7 or 8. And that's actually, for some children, that's not too late, but in some respects, not ideal. Because you can be doing a lot of important work with these young children. You're seeing risk signs, and you may not feel 100% confident that that child has dyslexia, but you see a lot of the signs, which would mean let's do some things that will get that student, that child, the help that he or she needs.
And specifically, what type of intervention is so important once identified, even at a young age, Margie?
So at a young age, if the problem resides in that phonological domain, that is, hearing those sounds and being able to make sense of them, and ultimately when learning to read, understanding that those sounds map onto letters, right? That's our code. And any alphabetic language has a specific code that children have to learn. so that ideally and ultimately they know that code well enough to be able to recognize any word instantly. That's the key to being a fluent reader. So children that struggle with this skill and that processing that I just referred to need a lot of practice with phonemic awareness, with the sound letter correspondences, with recognizing patterns in words that will help them instantly recognize those words. They need very explicit instruction in how our English language works. At the sound level, at the sound to letter level, at the the word and meaning level. They need explicit instruction and lots of practice. They need practice with connected text. So we don't want to be drilling and killing these skills in isolation. They have to know how to apply them in reading, and in reading authentic text as well as decodable text. So it's a building block kind of process and phenomenon. And as I mentioned earlier, you need a skilled teacher who knows how to not only teach those things, but monitor progress so that we know if we're moving fast enough to close the gap, but slow enough to get to mastery.
Okay, and that's so important to know. I know tutoring is expensive. Some schools may not have the proper resources, but parents do need to know that the person working with their child must have the proper training.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is critically important.
Okay. Several more questions. You mentioned before reading specialists, special education teachers. EBS would like to know, what do you see as the SLP, or speech language pathologist's role in dyslexia?
So a great question. The speech and language pathologists have a background in language, and dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. What I hear SLPs tell me, however, is that their background isn't necessarily in the language literacy connection. They can explain the role of language in learning to read, but here's where we want to forge relationships and collaborations between, say, for example, a speech and language pathologist and a special ed teacher, a speech and language pathologist and even a general ed teacher or whatever, so that there's a conversation that occurs where we're taking the expertise of these individuals and problem solving for the child based on what the child might need. So in many schools, I've seen speech and language pathologists pushing in to general ed classrooms during the literacy block and lending their expertise, particularly for these children that have these language-based learning disabilities. So they play a very important role because they have a great deal of expertise.
Okay, great. Thank you, Margie. Morning is asking about her 14-year-old who is diagnosed with dyslexia because the reading comprehension, or her child's reading comprehension, was at 30%, she says. She adds that her daughter has binocular vision disorder and auditory processing disorder and can't remember what she reads. So Morning would like to know, how does she figure out what's causing this and what kind of supports would her daughter need?
So that's a complex question. I think you really want to seek expertise in those disorders. But you raise an important question, Morning, and an important point, and that is something we refer to as comorbidity, or the co-occurrence of a number of different difficulties. So dyslexia, again, as I mentioned, usually impacts phonological awareness, but we often have children who are identified with dyslexia who might have, in Morning's child's case, an auditory processing disorder as well. Or they might have a processing speed difficulty, or they may have working memory difficulty. So what you really want to look for is a clear understanding of what are these co-occurring difficulties and how do they impact learning, and how are we going to address those co-occurring learning challenges or difficulties or disorders in a way that's going to help the student be successful. The research is pretty clear that we don't treat those disorders in isolation, that we look at how those disorders impact each other and the learning and address them in the context of the academic setting, because in fact, that's what we have to be paying attention to if we want children to learn and succeed in school.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. CO would like you to speak about stealth dyslexia. Now, this is a term I was very unfamiliar with until maybe about a year ago, Margie. Her son is twice exceptional, 2E, and hides it well. But dyslexia for her son presents in his writing and in math too. So she'd like to know, how can she convince the school to help him at a fundamental level instead of just applying Band-Aids, as she said, with accommodations?
That's another great question. And again, it speaks to the fact that no two dyslexics are alike. So we often have students, in this case, a child who is dyslexic, has those phonological processing difficulties that impact word reading, but the child at the same time has exceptional skills and gifts, and in this case, high intelligence, meaning that the child is probably very verbal, has very good language comprehension skills. And in this case, sometimes there's a disconnect. So teachers don't necessarily, they see this child as being very smart, very capable, and they may be misunderstanding the child's difficulty as being lazy or not interested. And so we really have to work with the skill needs, in this case, helping the child with word reading and the word recognition skills and spelling and writing, but at the same time, making sure that we're using those strengths, that twice exceptional piece, as a way to motivate them, engage them, encourage them to keep learning and reaching their highest potential. And here is where we run into problems, because the school will say, well, they're doing just fine, they're on grade level, but a twice exceptional child, in fact, should be achieving at a higher level because their intelligence is such that they should be reading above grade level. And where schools may not want to go beyond where they are going because they're perfectly happy with a child that's, meeting the grade level skills, in fact, a parent would be encouraged to get the help. And there's some really great resources now. I think I've learned about and seen some great resources available for parents who have students who are twice exceptional.
Okay, great. Thank you for clearing that up, Margie. Daisy wants to know, Daisy did ask you a question before about the age of diagnosis. Is Orton Gillingham a good program for children with dyslexia?
So I would say yes, but I would qualify that because Orton Gillingham is an approach. So I think in understanding an approach versus a program is important for parents to know. So a program is something that is delivered in a specific sequence, in a specific way. Programs are often more scripted and sequential, and they follow, as I said, a certain order. And an example of a program that many parents are probably familiar with is the Wilson Reading Program or Wilson Reading System. Wilson is based on Orton Gillingham principles. So I would say that Orton Gillingham as an approach that is also included in many programs, including Wilson and lots of others, is a very well-respected, well-established, and in some cases, well-researched methodology that basically is teaching the structure of the English language. And again, going back to the fact that we said dyslexia is a language-based learning disability, teachers need to understand how to explain English and its structure. And because English happens to be a difficult language, we have a higher incidence in English, for English-speaking children in this this whole concept of mapping words onto their spellings. We have lots of children who have trouble with that because we have so many layers of English. So again, Orton Gillingham teaches that method, uses that method to help kids and demystify the complexity of language by teaching all those pieces. So, but teachers obviously need to learn that methodology in order to teach the kids that understanding, build that understanding.
Yep, definitely. Okay, great. And also, we have several resources on our site about reading intervention approaches. We're going to put a link in the chat box, and you can read a little bit more deeply about Orton Gillingham-based programs and approaches, I should say, and just get a little bit more information. Thank you, Margie. All right, another question from JH123. My daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia and had an IEP for just 1 year, but then it was taken away after she was doing well, okay? And now she only has a 504 plan at school. JH123 wants to know, how do I do progress evaluations at home? And how do I help her develop reading skills?
I guess my first reaction to that question is a parent shouldn't have to be teaching those skills. It's up to the school to do that. Having said that, I understand where she's coming from because she doesn't want her child to get behind. I guess I would almost say go back to the school, and especially with some data, and asking the school for data that shows that she's still on target. Because dyslexia is a lifelong learning disability. It's not something you outgrow. And while remediation certainly is important and will sometimes catch children up, what I've noticed is as school progresses and the work gets harder and kids are asked to do more reading and writing and academic work, they get overwhelmed. So they prematurely exit students in some cases from these services, give them a 504 that does give them some accommodations, but it doesn't take the place of direct services and intervention. So I would caution and say to the mom, make sure that she's still on point and that, she continues to advocate for her child. Even though she was exited doesn't mean she can't go back and be, determined eligible again.
And mom is able to actually ask for a 504 meeting if she has some issues that she's concerned about just at any time. Am I right, Margie?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, Candela wants to know, she says it seems like her child can read okay, but she skips and adds words as she is reading. Her child also has ADHD. So is it related, and is this something typical for a child with ADHD?
Yes, I would say we see this a lot, and I don't know for sure if it's a function of the attention. I've seen children who don't have ADHD do the same thing. They skip little words, they add little words, they're not paying attention to every single word, and it would seem intuitive that it would be related to the attention issues. But again, I've seen students do that, have that same behavior without attention issues. It really, again, has to do with the fact that they may not be monitoring their comprehension closely because they're so focused on reading the words. And as a skilled reader, you're monitoring your comprehension as you go. And if it's not making sense, you stop reading, or you go back and reread, or you think about what you read. You're monitoring your comprehension. Our children don't do that necessarily. They're really trying just to get those words off the page. And if the child is still really not or automatic in that skill, they could easily be missing some words or inserting words where they don't belong. Reading through punctuation is another common thing that we'll see with students. Again, it gives us a clue that they're not paying attention to their reading and what they're understanding as they read, because that's a complex thing that they have to do, and it just takes a lot of practice.
Okay, great. we're nearing, believe it or not, the end of our chat. So I'm going to try to get to maybe one or two more questions. So here we go. White Rabbit asks, what are the signs of dyslexia for a child in second or third grade?
So the signs for dyslexia in second or third grade would be inaccurate word reading, so making mistakes when they read words. It would be still sounding out words, sound by sound, instead of being able to automatically recognize them. By second and third grade, we would expect children to be able to instantly recognize those words. Another sign would be that retention phenomenon that we talked about earlier. So maybe seemingly have mastered certain basic skills and then, a day later, a week later, not retaining it. It could be manifested in spelling, where we often see these kids who are decent at reading, but their spelling is not very good. And that really does, again, go back to these unstable phonic orthographic, we call them, or written way. How does the word sound and what does it look like? And those are unstable for students with dyslexia. I think avoiding reading is certainly another sign. Not wanting to read because it's hard, because they don't want people to notice. So they avoid reading, certainly out loud with their peers. Writing, we start to see in second and third grade children struggling with the writing, and they have great ideas in their head, but when they try to go to write it down, there's so many things that they have to coordinate. Whether it's the formation of the letter and how the words are spelled, and keeping the idea in their head while they're trying to remember how to write the words. So writing is going to often reflect, and you're going to see the disparity between a child who has very good, verbal skills and is able to express orally, but when it comes to getting it down on paper, that's where you see a real breakdown occur. So I think those are some of the highlights of things that I would look for in second and third grade.
Okay, great. All right, so there's a couple of questions that have cropped up about high school students. So this is really good. Ruby wants to know if a child who is diagnosed in high school, they read, right? She's saying they read, or this child reads, but reads slowly. I'm trying to just put this together. Is there a way to reteach the child all right, so let's just narrow that down. For a child who's in high school and is still struggling with reading, what can be done? And someone else is asking if high schools still have reading specialists.
Mm-hmm. I think they do, but they're certainly not as common. And the other problem in high school is that you have these content area, disciplinary classes, science, social studies, math, etc. And those teachers are not given the tools to teach a child who's struggling with reading. And they say that quite, candidly and openly. I'm not a reading teacher. But we know that we have children going to high school who don't read very proficiently. And so those content teachers need to have at least an understanding of what reading entails beyond what their discipline is asking them to teach, right? And then, in addition to that, many students still do need a reading specialist. So it does get more complicated, and schedules dictate, and how many credits you need to graduate, that dictates, and there's all sorts of constraints when you get to high school. I would say that by high school, this student should be using assistive technology, and there's a lot of assistive technology that is just phenomenal, that doesn't replace, but certainly levels the playing field. And there are programs like, I just saw a presentation this past weekend on something called Read, Write, Gold, and it actually encourages the child to be watching the screen as the text is read, So it has the software that reads the text to the student, but the students who make the most gains and they continue to improve their reading skills are the students that are following along as the text is being read to them. So they're paying attention and they're actually practicing building reading fluency skills as they're listening the text being read to them, which is different than listening to a book on tape where you're just taking it in, auditorily, but you're not looking at it. So you're not watching how the words, how the sounds of the words match what they look like in print. So I think, those are just some ideas to think about.
Right, and I have to mention that my own son, who has dyslexia throughout middle school and high school, depended so much on text-to-speech. In fact, one of Understood's founding partners is Benentech, who actually puts out Bookshare. So Bookshare is a great way to access text-to-speech. We also have so many resources on assistive technology on our website for reading, writing, all kinds of issues. So I encourage you to check out those resources as well. Thanks so much, Margie, for bringing up assistive technology as an equalizer.
Of course, so important.
Yeah. All right. So I'm afraid we've run out of time. This has been a wonderful chat, very informative, and obviously, reaches all grade levels, not only elementary kids just learning to read, but even at the high school level. So thank you so much, Margie, for being with us.
Welcome, Jenny. Thanks for inviting me to come.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. If you've missed any portion of this chat or you'd like to watch it again, we archive all of our chats at u.org/calendar. And if you'd like to join other parents and experts, we have a wonderful online community which you can join by going to u.org/community. Thank you once again for joining today, and have a great afternoon.